Good morning, Darren.
Good morning, Jonathan. Great to be with you.
It's an enormous pleasure to talk with you today. So we are having a conversation today about what specifically New York City policymakers can do to build a more equitable city. One of the reasons I'm so excited to talk with you is that attacking inequality has been the Ford Foundation's defining strategy for almost a decade now. Given all that you've been doing and learning, what advice do you have for city leaders in New York? Are there any specific policies or strategies that you think city policymakers should prioritize to help make progress toward a more equitable city?
Well, there's no doubt, Jonathan, that we have major challenges of inequality in New York City, inequality in the structures and systems of our economy. So we need to talk about the ways our economy, our local economy, is structured that produce inequality. And we have to talk about the way policy and employers come together to help solve this and help reduce inequality. So I would suggest that we use every lever, the levers of policy and the levers of investment to achieve this objective of reducing inequality.
And I'm curious, in all your work at the foundation, are there things that you've seen in other cities or states that you found to be particularly successful, whether it's in pulling together businesses and kind of leveraging them to move towards expanding access to good jobs, or taking other steps to create a more equitable city? What can you tell us that's worked that you think might be a model?
Well, there are a number of things. So let's just talk about a few. For example, cities who have encouraged employers to hire people, for example, who are formerly incarcerated. This is a major challenge, as in New York State, we are reducing, thankfully, the number of incarcerated people. And that is going to pose a challenge for both those individuals and the communities they return to. So employers need to be encouraged to hire formerly incarcerated men and women. And that is one policy I'm a big fan of. Another policy, of course, relates to family leave and the opportunity for workers to care for family members. That's critical. Another policy relates to childcare. And New York City has made very good progress in early childhood and in childcare. I think we need to do more in this regard. Those are three. On the investment side, and this is where I think we really need to drill down. My grandfather was a semi-literate man with a third grade education. He worked as a porter in an oil company, and he received, as part of his employment, shares in the company when the company did well. It was an old-fashioned profit sharing program for every employee of the company. We no longer have these programs where workers were owners of the companies they worked for. I think New York City needs to, through its investment capacity, encourage the companies it invests in to make workers owners. We know from the research that workers who are owners are more productive, have higher levels of satisfaction, and over time, those companies are more valuable. And so for me, if we really look at the issue of inequality, the wealth gap between Black and white and brown households, this lack of equity is a fundamental reason why inequality has grown over the last 3 decades, in addition to the issue of wage stagnation, which has hit all households, working households, Black, white, and brown.
That's really important. And you've mentioned a couple of times the importance of encouraging employers, because they seem to play a really important role in wealth creation and expanding access to good jobs. And I'm curious, what can the mayor or city hall do to not only encourage but to pull employers together? Should we as a city be incentivizing employers? Should we be providing sticks that really kind of penalize them if they don't do certain things? I'm curious, how do you get more employers in the city to the table? We've seen some really important steps with the Job CEO Council in New York City. They're taking steps around apprenticeships and other training programs. But to go even beyond that, I'm curious, do you have some advice?
Well, I think there needs to be an ongoing permanent mechanism for employers and the city to work collectively. We have some very good legacy structures. The Partnership for New York City is one, as you said, the Jobs Council. There are these project-specific initiatives, but what we really need is an ongoing table where the largest employers of the city and key people at City Hall and the council chair and speaker, we need all of them to have a table that is an ongoing forum to problem solve.
You know, the example you mentioned around profit sharing in Texas reminds me of an important wealth creation program, or a program to close the wealth gap that I heard you mention recently. You said that in the 1980s and 90s, the Ford Foundation invested in what was then a new idea to help close the wealth gap, known as baby bonds. At the time, it didn't catch on in a big way, but in the past few years, or the past decade, policymakers in several states and cities, including New York, have embraced the idea of baby bonds and put resources behind it. On the one hand, it's really troubling it took so long for this to catch on, but I bring this up really to ask you if there are other big ideas that the foundation has been investing in more recently that you think the public sector, whether it's nationally, but hopefully in New York, should really get behind.
Well, there's no doubt that the role of foundations, and certainly at Ford, has been to invest in ideas and innovation. And so back in the 1980s, Michael Sheridan's work was new and innovative, this idea of how we can close the Black-white wealth gap. That was almost 40 years ago when we first started this work. And it is just a reminder of the long game that foundations play in helping to propose solutions for systemic challenges. In this case, there were a number of efforts that were included in a package of initiatives we worked on in the 1980s and 90s that included mortgage programs for first-time home buyers, also cash transfers. Again, the idea that unrestricted cash could be provided to lower income working households. And then there were conditional cash transfer programs that were also, I think, successful and innovative, but very difficult to implement and support at scale. I think the challenge here is not a lack of innovation. I think the challenge is a lack of will and a lack of capacity to organize and sustain the key stakeholders who need to be engaged. Unfortunately, politics gets in the way. And one of the really regrettable things we have seen over these last few years in New York is an unwillingness of our leaders, particularly at the state and city level, to come together, to work collectively. Petty politics and personalities have played too much a role. And we as the citizenry need to demand that our leaders work together at the state level, the governor, the mayor, that they work together for us to deliver on solutions that are within reach on some of these major issues.
Absolutely. You know, and what you said reminds me that you know, Ford is just one of so many dozens of really remarkable philanthropic foundations in the city. We're so lucky to have them. They played a really big role in supporting innovative nonprofit programs around poverty and inequality, many of which are having a really big impact, but also many of them are having an impact at a fairly small scale. And I guess I wanted to ask you, how do we get city government in New York to help scale up more of these effective nonprofit initiatives? We know that there are things that are working. You cited a few that Ford has supported over the years, but it seems fairly rare that government will step in and help get those to the next level to reach far more New Yorkers. Is there a model for a government philanthropy partnership that you'd like to suggest?
Well, there's no doubt that New York City has a rich and vibrant philanthropic community, and the city has benefited from that. And Ford is just one of many, many players in this city. There are models. For example, at the state level in California, we participated in an initiative that Governor Newsom organized around basically a forum where philanthropy and state government and private employers came together around scaling key initiatives that were priorities for the governor. There's no doubt that philanthropy is limited in its capacity to both fund at scale and to sustain funding over long periods of time. There are models. We used to have many models where government would work in partnership and then scale. Government has lost its will and in some cases its capacity to do that, partly because of revenue challenges. There's no doubt that many of these initiatives require new revenue or redirected revenue, and there has not been a willingness, an ability to actually do one of those two things, to generate new revenue or to redirect existing revenue towards higher priorities. And I think this is where leadership comes into play. We have to demand a quality of leadership and decision-making that makes it possible to imagine that we really are going to deploy public capital towards the highest priorities and the best uses of our public purse.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have to end there, Darren, but this was so wonderful. Thank you very much for taking the time with us this morning, and best wishes with all you're doing.
Thanks, Jonathan. Always great to be with you.
Take care.